Hello and welcome. Thank you so much for coming to our event today on plastics in the food system. It's great to see so many people here. It reflects, I think, that people have concern about this issue. I want to also, just before we go anywhere, to say a big thank you to the organisers of the World Public Health Nutrition Congress and the Association for giving this space to us to talk about this issue. We really appreciate it. We appreciate the partnership they've shown, and also the technical support that helps us with our rather complex programme this afternoon. Thanks very much. My name is Joe Yates. I'm the co-director of the Agricultural Nutrition and Health Academy at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. Before I go any further, I'm just going to tell you a little bit about the ANH Academy. We are a global network, a community of researchers, practitioners and policymakers around the world, working together across disciplines and sectors to address problems associated with food and food systems and nutrition and health. We've got over 10,000 members in over 145 countries. The whole ethos of our community is to break down barriers to participation in science, to break down barriers, hierarchies, geographies, sectors, whatever separates us from forging collaborations and doing new work together, trying to facilitate the uptake of evidence and knowledge into policy processes and just to share capacity among one another. So if you're interested in this kind of thing, and you're working on agriculture or food or anything related to what you hear today, please consider joining. It's free of charge, and we've got an exhibition stand downstairs so you can hear more about it there. I just want to also declare that as organisers and curators of this session, we haven't got any conflicts of interests, and it's really, really heartening to see people make these declarations this week throughout the event. So, what do we want to achieve from today's session? First and foremost, we want to highlight that plastics are an absolute central food system issue, an issue that cuts across all of the other issues that we have been here talking about this week. Things like rights, justice, power, diets, the environment, biodiversity, health. Plastics relates to all of them, and especially the plastics that are involved in our food systems. We want to harness the momentum and the expertise and the political will that's in this room and across the food systems community right now to help address this problem together. And we want to look beyond short-term efficiency and productivity and think about plastics more holistically to look at the broader effects. In doing this, one of the most important things we want to emphasise is the chemical burden of plastics and just how pervasive this is across our food systems and across the wider societies. And in doing that, we want to also then have a little discussion about essentiality, like which plastics serve critical functions in the food system and which ones do not. And if there are plastics that do not serve any critical functions, then we need to really consider transitioning away from them as soon as possible, but transitioning in a way which has justice and rights at its very heart. So I hope you'll join us on this journey today and continue the discussion after the event. So here's how the event's going to work. We're going to spend a couple of minutes now providing some rationale, a bit more rationale for why we think this is important. Then my colleague Megan is going to take us on a kind of 101 introduction to plastics, just to bring us all up to a baseline level of understanding of what exactly they are. Then we've got a really exciting panel on experiences and evidence on the impacts of plastics across the food system. Then we'll take a short break so people can stretch and have refreshments and have some comfort break, and then we'll come straight back. We'll probably have the break if you can stay in this room because it's very short. We'll come back for our second panel, which is all about science, policy and actions and what we can do together to advance responses to this challenge. And then we'll probably all need a drink after that because it's a pretty heavy topic. So I hope you can join us and just continue the conversation. Our speakers will be here, they're up for chatting. So please stay to the end if you can. So the context, before we talk about plastics themselves, the context I think we can all agree on. I mean, we've heard it all week. Food systems are working for a very small number of people in this world, and for everyone else, they're simply not working, and for the planet itself. Diets are the number one risk factor in the global burden of disease. Ultra-processed foods, as we've heard all week, are expanding with their adverse effects everywhere. Realising the right to food that is not only just food, but is healthy and safe food, is simply unaffordable and untenable for a large majority of people around the world. And the way that we produce this and supply this food is just linked inherently to our food systems, which just still remain linear, and they still have their roots in colonial times, They're extractive, wasteful and pollutive at almost every single stage, and we're going to demonstrate this today. And as part of this story, the rights, as we all know, and the rights of landholders, indigenous peoples, workers and consumers are being eroded. Meanwhile, in the background, we see that power is concentrating among several, or a handful of very large transnational companies. Plastics are absolutely essential and integral to this current food system we have. They're everywhere across this food system. They're an enabling factor. They're emblematic of the system that we've created, not just the food system, but the society that we've created around consumption as well, and a throwaway culture. And as a result, plastics are also ubiquitous across our food system and our society. They're ubiquitous throughout our whole human life course, from the moment we begin our lives through to later moments in our lives. They're ubiquitous across the food supply chain, and these are just some examples. Polymer-coated fertilizers that we put into our soils, plastic mulches and road covers that we put on our soils, pesticide containers, bale wraps, aquaculture equipment, fishing gear, storage and transportation containers, processing equipment, bottles, kitchen equipment, takeaway packaging. I could go on. Waste management systems themselves. You can think of hundreds of more applications across food systems. And they're ubiquitous across our food chains as well. In the smallest microorganisms they've been found, and in the largest mammals. And they're visible under microscopes, and they're visible from space. I'm sure you've seen this. This is Almeria and Andalusia in Spain. And to give you a sense of the scale of this challenge, here's some illustrative facts. So over 12.5 million tonnes of plastics are used every year just in agriculture, fisheries and aquaculture alone. In China, over 10% of its cultivated land mass is covered in plastic mulch and sheets. The global value of the food packaging market is over $456 billion, and over 37 million tonnes of plastic packaging is used every year for food. And across almost every piece of available data that you can see for plastics, and plastics related to the food systems, we see growth projected. So the food packaging market is expected to grow by 60% in the next 6 years. So it's just simply incredible to see in front of us, isn't it? And I'm sure we all probably think to ourselves, we recycle, we do what we can as individuals in this system. We use the right bins, we put it in the right place, we hope it goes to the right place. But just 9% of plastics that have ever existed have been successfully recycled. And successful is subjective as well, because recycling itself is energy intensive. In many cases, it's chemically intensive. And agricultural plastics and plastics used across the food system are some of the most hard, difficult plastics to recover because of their spoilage and because of, we're going to hear in detail exactly what happens to them. I do want to pause also before we go into our discussion, just for some balance, so that we understand as well why plastics have become so prevalent across our food systems. And these are just some examples, but Megan's going to tell us a little bit more in a minute just about why they're so cheap and versatile and functional. But they are incredible materials, a group of materials. They've been kept cheap for a reason. And some functions, I should say, I want to stress that, served by plastics have been shown to have benefits. For instance, polytunnels, greenhouses, mulching. They have been shown to have some benefits on yields, on productivity, and extending growing seasons, things like that, which are really important. And we can't deny those things. And when it comes to farmers and some of the people with the most precarious lifestyles in the world, economically and environmentally, plastics are critically important, or these functions are critically important, so we need to bear that in mind. Similarly, for packaging, there's no denying that some plastics are a barrier to pathogens and bacteria, and therefore they do aid food preservation and shelf life and potentially transportation in some contexts. But as you know, from the nutrition community and the food systems community, and whatever discipline you've come from, a narrow focus on just some variables and some factors means that we obscure the whole picture. We don't see what's going on, and we do know that plastics have played a role in the rise of unhealthy foods. So you can just pause for a second and think, can you think of a single ultra-processed food that hasn't been implicated with plastic at some point in its life? Most of them are wrapped in plastic, but even if they're not wrapped in plastic, you'll see early in their life cycle that they have come into contact. And so really, before I hand over to Megan, I just want to, it's an example of the type of things we need to do more of, and we need help from this community on. is to challenge these misconceptions and these simplifications that are often peddled by vested interests who benefit. For instance, we've learned, that calories don't equate to food security. We know that now. Yeah. We know that carbon mitigation doesn't equate to sustainable diets in itself. We need to look at more. And therefore, for instance, on plastics, we know that yields, productivity, and efficiency in itself cannot be equated with food security, although it is all the time. And we know that food preservation alone cannot be equated with preventing food waste. So we need help. This is a huge challenge, as you can imagine. The people, the groups, the forces that are coming into contact with this are very difficult to challenge. And in some cases, the interests that you are working on or working to uncover are the same interests that are operating in this space, and some of them at the same company, for instance, Cargill, that sells all sorts of food-related products, but also all sorts of plastic additives and things like that. And so with that, I'd like to hand over to my colleague Megan Deeney, who's a research fellow at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. Megan's work focuses on life cycle impacts, human health impacts of plastics, and she's going to tell us what exactly they are.
Great, thanks so much, Joe, and thanks so much everyone for being here. It's so fantastic to have such a full house. I'm just going to take a very brief step back and ask, what are plastics? This is really an umbrella term that describes an incredibly diverse group of materials, but what they have in common is this ability to be melted, moulded, and really shaped into any form that we can particularly imagine. It can be rigid, flexible, opaque, transparent, any shape, any size, any colour, and they have these incredible added properties, things like flame resistance, shock resistance. As Joe mentioned, they can act as barriers to bacteria and moisture, and of course their lightweight, strength and durability. And so in part, this is why they've been so widely used, not least in food systems, but of course now so overexploited and so ubiquitous in our societies and natural environments. So more than 99% of plastic is still derived from fossil fuels, and for the most part this is directly extracted from the earth. Bio-based plastics, those from plant sources, occupy less than 1% of global markets for plastics. And now this fossil carbon is actually 300 million year old dead plants and plankton, and compressed over long periods of time, clearly under high pressure and high temperatures. This forms the incredible but finite fossil-based energy source and has really powered our global economies. And plastics are actually a side product of this heavily subsidized fossil fuel production. They're a way of utilizing the waste products of oil refining. And so this artificially cheap fossil feedstock, combined with aggressive marketing of plastic single-use products, has really driven the boom in global plastic consumption since the 1950s. And what we now know is that it's very likely that we have already transgressed planetary boundaries for novel entities, and that includes microplastics. Despite this, by 2060, it's very likely that we will almost triple again plastic production and plastic waste. And by this time, plastics could account for more than 20% of global oil consumption and over 4 gigatons of carbon emissions each year. And we've actually already outdone the aviation sector in this particular regard. And so you can see, I hope, that the plastic pollution crisis is also deeply entrenched in the climate crisis. Unfortunately, it's not just the carbon aspect of plastics that we need to worry about. So when we make plastics, it's a very complex set of chemical reactions that takes monomers like ethylene and propylene and turns them into polymers, and essentially linking them together in up to 10,000 repeat units. So far, that's relatively simple. What we need to worry about really is all of the other chemicals that we then add in, and these are the chemicals that really give plastic its physical and functional properties. These are things like UV stabilizers, like plasticizers that give plastic its flexibility, like the flame retardants. And in actual fact, those can make up to 70% of the plastic by weight. So I hope that you can see that plastics are chemicals. They are carbon plus chemicals. Added to this, we then also add in processing aids and catalysts into the chemical mix, and there's a whole range of chemicals that were never supposed to be there at all. So these are things like impurities, degradation products, and compounds formed during the chemical manufacturing processes. all in all, we have over 16,000 different plastic chemicals. And the really worrying thing is that, for the most part, we really don't know what function these chemicals are serving. And there's also, for over 10,000 of them, no hazard data available that tell us what impact they might have on human health. And you should know also that just less than 6% of these chemicals are regulated under global frameworks. And so really what we have in plastics is this complex mix of carbon-derived chemical cocktail plastic materials, each one that behaves very differently one polymer to another, that pose different challenges and have different functions. And this is made so much harder to manage by the lack of information available from industry. And so actually, ironically, plastics may be one of the least transparent materials on the market. Joe's mentioned that plastics are used extensively throughout food systems, and behind each of these plastic products is an entire life cycle, beginning long before the plastic comes into use and going on very long afterwards, unfortunately. And all of these stages impact human health and potentially food systems. So, for example, of all of these life cycle stages, we know that the greatest amount of carbon emissions actually come from plastic production. And as we know, climate change is already impacting human health through heat-related morbidity and mortality, but also through extreme weather events like drought and flooding, which are impacting our ability to produce food and also disrupting supply chains. And of course, this has compounding effects on human health. What's more, petrochemical industries tend to be concentrated in certain communities, often low-income communities, like, for example, along the Mississippi River in Louisiana, where in just an 85-mile stretch of land, there's over 200 petrochemical plants, and they produce 25% of the US petrochemical supply. Another really critical example is in the lands of indigenous peoples, so for example, the Anjuna community, the First Nation, where there's been a recent state of emergency called due to more than one benzene chemical leak in the area. And these communities experience disproportionately high levels of cancer and other diseases, and are also subject to intimidation and human rights abuses. And so as we move through the plastic life cycle, plastics shed microplastics and nanoplastics and chemicals are leaked as well throughout the use and as a result of the use, which has the potential to disrupt food production and also to contaminate food sources. At the end of life this year, about half of plastics will go to landfill, 20% will be incinerated, and a further 20% will end up in open dump sites, open burning, and environmental leakage, and just 11% will be recycled. And at this stage, there are numerous health impacts, from respiratory diseases that are linked to emissions from open burning and incineration, to creating very unsafe, very unhygienic working conditions for the 20 million waste pickers around the world who carry out 60% of our global plastic recycling. So our first panel is going to help us really dive into some of those impacts. This is the heavy stuff. And what I want to just briefly touch on now is what we're doing about it at a global level. So in March of 2022, there was a historic resolution passed to develop, by the end of this year, a global legally binding treaty to end plastic pollution. And so far, government delegates from 175 countries have met 4 times, the most recent being in Canada, in Ottawa, which ended just last month. And we started this session with a draft treaty text of over 60 pages. Luckily, we ended with a slightly shorter text, but with over 3,600 text brackets, which gives you some idea, I hope, of the divergence in national opinions about what should be included and how in this treaty. So the final session that is scheduled will happen in November of this year in Busan, Korea, and clearly there's significant work to be done if we're to leave that session with a workable treaty. One of the main points of contention is between countries that want to see essentially a waste management treaty dealing with plastics at the downstream and improving waste management, versus those that want to see upstream measures to reduce overall plastic production. And throughout this process, certain industries have argued that by removing plastics, we will threaten food security and water security, risk food safety and hygiene, and cause greater emissions through material substitutions. And this is really where you come in. So we need food system researchers, knowledge keepers, policymakers, experts and activists to come together around this issue so that we can guide evidence and rights-based decision-making in this space. And I hope that you can see that this knowledge and expertise will really come together in terms of deciphering which plastics can be removed from food systems, which can be substituted, and which we really need to keep, which are essential for food, and how can we make those ones safer and more sustainable. So I'd just like to leave on a thought that this is really an incredible opportunity. Thank you for coming, for food systems to drive meaningful change towards ending plastic pollution, and also to simultaneously create more sustainable and more resilient food systems in themselves. So it's my absolute pleasure to hand over to Melissa Wang, who's a senior scientist at Greenpeace at Exeter University and an expert ecotoxicologist, very much at the forefront of the science policy interface on plastic pollution. So thank you very much, Melissa.
Thank you very much, Megan. And welcome, friends and colleagues, to this special session. I asked Megan to kindly pick this one because on the 19th of April, 1:30 a.m. in Ottawa Airport, it was empty arrival hall. So while I was waiting for my luggage, I just looked around, and this is exactly what was not only waiting for me, but for all those participants arriving in Ottawa, attending the fourth round of the plastic treaty negotiation meeting. And while looking at that, it brought up a quite mixed feeling, and I feel we need to have a good discussion with and among the community of the system of nutrition and of health, and not only with the business community who paid for those ads, but also with the community of scientists, of stakeholders, and rights holders on this specific topic. So voila, we have it today. So a special thanks to Joe and Megan for their fantastic effort to secure a special session on plastics in this great conference. So today we're going to have two panels in total. One will be focusing on the experiences and evidence of the impacts of plastics across the whole life cycle of food system, and the second one will be focusing on the implication and responses. So our first panel, we will have four great speakers with us today. Each of them will be given 10 minutes to touch on different perspectives on the life cycle impacts. And colleagues, please keep your questions. We will have some time at the end of this panel to allow you to pose some maybe difficult questions to our speakers. So our first speaker will be Suzanne Smoke from Society of Native Nations. I will try my best to do the correct pronunciation. She is Anishinaabe of the Mississaugas of Rice Lake. She sits with the Bear Clan. As a knowledge keeper, she has a passion for food sovereignty and the health of the community. Suzanne works in violence against women, specializing in obstetric violence. She serves as community outreach with Society of Native Nations. Suzanne, over to you to tell us about the experience of those whose lives are affected by plastics even before they come into use. Suzanne, over to you. Thank you.
Home for me. And for me, this Monoman, this beautiful gift, is that gift that Creator told us to find, that gift that grows on the water. And it's just so important that we retrace those steps back and pick up those things that have been lost. Spending time away from our communities, our homelands, in these urban settings, there's a real disconnect to the traditional foods and that way of life. And we see it permeating in the way that we live, with our weight, with diabetes, with our health. And it's so important to pick up these traditional foods. Right now, my role and responsibility in community, I work in sexual assault and domestic violence, and I also work in mental wellness. And for me, it's all tied to the food. It's tied to what we're putting in our bodies and what are we taking in. This monomen that comes from the water, we're water carriers as women. We sing for the water and we carry that new life. And being from the Mississaugas of Rice Lake, from Alderville, it's my responsibility to look after the water and to look after this beautiful monomen within our communities, and starting to teach our young ones these ways. And it's really, really important, especially right now with COVID, with this whole pandemic and this sickness that's taken over all of the earth. It's really, really important. What are we doing about food sovereignty? What are we doing to feed our communities? So just this past, just since March, since COVID, we have arranged to have traditional food boxes gifted to all of our community members in the urban settings. We have given out over 400 boxes. We have another 300 this week, and we filled them with beautiful monomen. We filled them with beautiful maple syrup from Gijagat, black duck wild rice. We're also putting in honey from different First Nations. So we're making sure that not only are we driving our own economies, but we're feeding our own people. And this food sovereignty is so, so important right now, especially during this time of this great sickness. You know, Creator told Anishinaabe to go find the place where the food grows on the water, and this is one of those places. And this is just, every time that I throw this rice, every time that I offer that to the water, this is ceremony. This is like this beautiful life of ceremony. Every time that seed touches the water is ceremony. And it's so important for home for me. And for me, this monomen, this beautiful gift, in order to get back to our traditional ways of life. And when we talk about bringing in traditional ways of being, it doesn't mean that we're returning to the past. It means that we're going back and bringing the wisdom of our ancestors and bringing it forward, and how are we using that in natural law. Our food preservation, our seasonal lifestyles, the cultural differences and commonalities, and also the way that we cook, the techniques in which we harvest, preserve, all of those things need to be integrated, and we call that our Indigenous wisdom, traditional ecological knowledge. My work with INC 3 and 4 are really understanding that the traditional ecological knowledge needs to be embedded into the treaty process, into the treaty language, and really understanding that it's a human rights issue, it's a global issue, that we are the ones that are in the sacrifice zones as Indigenous, as Black and Brown communities. We are the ones that are the most highly impacted by plastics pollution. Aamjiwnaang First Nation, that my relative just spoke of, I'm a Sundancer. I Sundance, my daughter and I, in Aamjiwnaang First Nation. They have over 60 refineries within a 1.5 mile radius of the community. On our way to INC 4, there was a benzene leak, and the community, many of the community members got sick and were rushed to the hospital. I remember as a teenager visiting Aamjiwnaang, and all of the young children in the daycare dropped to the ground. And it was the refineries who self-regulate, who sound the alarm for their employees if there's a benzene leak or there's a problem, but they did not alert the community. This has been ongoing for over 150 years, that this community has been surrounded by over 60 oil refineries, that the fuel industry, that's the start of the plastic cycle, the death cycle of our communities. We have to really look at that from the beginning, because it's impacting our communities. Fort Chip, which is south of the Ring of Fire, they have what we call the Fort Chip Special. Our relatives talk about how they're the only ones with bile duct cancer. All across Canada, it's unheard of, that they've never even seen that before, but we're seeing it in our communities. In Fort Chip, they don't invest in schools, they don't invest in seniors' homes, they invest in graveyards, because that's what's happening in our communities. The death rates, the pollution rates in our bodies, the plastics in our bodies. When we talk about obstetric violence, when I look at this beautiful Navy and I look at the water and I look at the ceremonies, our water songs, that Navy were made of 87% water, 13% mineral. What happens to the water happens to us. And so what we're seeing now in Aamjiwnaang, with all of the chemical pollution around us, the birth rates of children has exponentially changed over the genetics of our communities have changed. We no longer have little boys being born in the community. It's really out of balance. And we believe that it's all because of the chemicals that has been surrounding this community for generations. So really understanding that the impact of chemical pollution in our food systems and our water systems, we are carrying that even in our bodies, in our waterways. As women, each and every one of you, women are your first environment. We are the only doorway with which the spirit, human spirit, comes to the earth. What happens to the water happens to us. And as women, we are sacred because we bring that new life to the earth. The plastics are now in our placentas. The plastics are going into our babies. That's obstetric violence over our next 7 generations. So we have to engage with all of our stakeholders all around the region. You have to really hoist and put natural law and traditional ecological knowledge at the forefront of these negotiations and the treaty talks that are happening in Canada. I can tell you as an Indigenous woman, being in one of the sacrifice zones, being in one of the areas where we're most impacted by colonial violence and resource extraction, that we are the ones that are on the front lines. We are the ones that are seeing. We are the ones with the lived experience and death experiences in our communities. And so, you know, when we're looking at treaty and who's coming into INC4, I was really in shock to see so many industry people in there really pushing and driving for the plastics industry. And I've been sitting here with their boots on our throats for 150 years in our communities, and they're going to speak over us and for us and not hear our voices at these tables. So it's really important that we understand that we have to engage with our communities in the black and brown areas, in our poverty-stricken areas, in the sacrifice zones. We have to engage with us because we are the experts in our communities. We are the knowledge keepers. We are the ones that know. We are the ones with our fingers on the pulse of what's happening in our communities. And it's inevitable that this obstetric violence is going to have greater impacts on the populations of our communities. And I mean, maybe that's the outcome. If we look at what's happening in the history of Canada with our children and resource extraction, not one treaty has ever been honored in Canada with engaging with Indigenous people. So at what point, when we talk about truth and reconciliation in our communities, where do we go from here to here in our communities? It's so important that we understand the traditional ecological knowledge that we carry should be at the forefront of these treaty negotiations. And also embedded with that is the protection of our language. I hear a lot of talk about nature-based solutions. Nature-based solutions is traditional ecological knowledge and needs to be protected within that treaty framework. That gift that grows on the water, and it's just so important that we retrace those steps back and pick up those things that have been lost. Spending time away from our communities, our homelands, in these urban settings, there's a real disconnect to the traditional foods and that way of life, and we see it permeating in the way that we live with our weight, with diabetes, with our health, and it's so important to pick up these traditional foods. Right now, my role and responsibility in community, I work in sexual assault and domestic violence, and I also work in mental wellness. And for me, it's all tied to the food. It's tied to what we're putting in our bodies and what are we taking in. This monomen that comes from the water, we're water carriers as women. We sing for the water and we carry that new life. And being from the Mississaugas of Rice Lake, from Alderville, it's my responsibility to look after the water and to look after this beautiful monomen within our communities and starting to teach our young ones these ways. And it's really, really important, especially right now with COVID, with this whole pandemic and the sickness that's taken over all of the earth. It's really, really important. What are we doing about food sovereignty? What are we doing to feed our communities? So just this past, just since March, since COVID, we have arranged to have traditional food boxes gifted to all of our community members in the urban settings. We have given out over 400 boxes. We have another 300 this week, and we filled them with beautiful monomen. We filled them with beautiful maple syrup from Gijagat, black duck wild rice. We're also putting in honey from different First Nations. So we're making sure that not only are we driving our own economies, but we're feeding our own people. And this food sovereignty is so, so important right now, especially during this time of this great sickness. You know, Creator told Anishinaabe to go find the place where the food grows on the water, and this is one of those places. And this is just, every time that I throw this rice, every time that I offer that to the water, this is ceremony. This is like this beautiful life of ceremony. Every time that seed touches the water is ceremony. And it's so important for our young ones to be reconnected with how beautiful this is.
Thank you very much, Suzanne. It's a very heavy topic, and what kind of shocked me when we had a quick bilateral before this session was that the same refinery plant which knocked her and her friends down 30 years ago is still there, leaking, polluting, and impacting the younger generation. And they see no signs how this could be stopped, even though it has been, this polluting industry has been there for over 150 years. So I think this is the question we have for our audience here and for our next panelists here, what can we do in order to respond to that and to help friends and colleagues like Suzanne and her community to win their own rights to have access to the safe and healthy environment to live and to develop. Thank you very much, Suzanne. And it's my honor to introduce our second speaker. It's another challenge to me in terms of pronunciation, which is Marie France Dinac. She is a senior researcher of the French National Institute for Research in Agriculture, Food, and the Environment, based in Paris. She is a leading expert in the dynamics of organic matter and pollutants in agricultural soil. Her research project aims to understand how complex ecological interaction between plants, microbes, and soil invertebrates, and how the accumulation of pollutants like the microplastics in soils impacts them. She is on the steering committee of the very famous Scientific Coalition for an Effective Plastic Treaty. Marie-France, over to you to tell us a bit more about the implication of plastics pollution on soils.
Thank you very much for the introduction, and good afternoon, everyone. And thank you also to Joe and Megan for inviting me to this session with such powerful talks already. So I would like to tell you about a wonderful thing, something that filtrates water, that feeds our vegetables, that mitigates climate change, something that is the home for 1/4 of the global biodiversity. And this wonderful thing is soil. So it's a thin layer, thin fertile layer at the surface of the earth, which makes possible the life on our very unique planet. There is no soil on Mars, there is no soil on the moon, there is only dust and rocks. And our very unique ecosystem provides a physical media for plant growth, but also provides essential nutrients for crops, which in turn will nourish humans. So it's a vital resource for global food security, for environmental sustainability, and for human well-being. But soils are a non-renewable resource at the scale of a human life. It takes hundreds to thousands of years to form soil. And soil today are threatened in most of the regions of the world. And the soil that we pollute or degrade today will take generations to recover. So 1/3 of the world's soils are degraded due to erosion, to loss of carbon and nutrients, to compaction, acidification, pollution, and so on. And all this soil degradation leads to reduced agricultural productivity, to food shortage, to desertification, biodiversity loss, to water scarcity, and it exacerbates all the global issues. And it's also a serious threat for nutrition and health for millions of people in the world, especially for the most vulnerable population. Because more than 90% of our food comes from soil. And crops that are produced on degraded soil might be nutrient depleted. If the soil is polluted, then the food might be contaminated.
So human health and soil health are closely linked together. And we know that soil can be polluted by heavy metals, by pesticides, by organic pollutants like benzene leakages from petrochemical industries, but they are also polluted by plastics and microplastics. Microplastics are tiny particles of plastic of size less than 5 millimeters, and nanoplastics, which are less than 1 micrometer in size. And where do these microplastics come? How they come to the soil? So there are several sources. First, they can come through the air. We know that the lighter plastic particles can circulate in the atmosphere and be deposited on the soil with the rain, for example. But in agricultural systems, there are also many other sources of microplastics, like the fertilizers we use. So we've heard about the inorganic fertilization. Inorganic fertilizer can be coated with synthetic polymer. So this is an article on a long-term experiment in Rosenstead in the UK, where they collected soil samples from since 1840, and they stored these samples, and they quantified microplastics in the soil over the years. And you can see there is a sharp increase in the microplastic content in these soils when they were fertilized with inorganic fertilization or with organic fertilization. Here it was manure, so manure is not supposed to contain plastic, but it's really a sign of the increasing use of plastics on the farms. Also, microplastic can come through compost amendment, especially from urban waste compost. So we have a study site in France where we quantified the microplastic of size 2 to 5 millimeters, so it's a larger microplastic, in soils that have received 20 years of urban waste compost amendment. And in the plowed layer of the soil, after 20 years, we found 400 kilograms per hectare of these particles. So 400 kilograms, it's equivalent to 80,000 plastic bags or 1,500 plastic bottles that would be distributed and accumulated in the soil. And they are closely linked to, they are closely associated with the soil structure. Like on the picture here, you see a close contact between a microplastic fragment and the soil aggregate, so it remains in the soil for a long time. Also, sewage sludge used as soil fertilizer is very common all over the world. In Europe, it's more, about 10 million tons of sewage sludge that is produced, and 40% of this is spread on farmlands, adding up to 40,000 tons of microplastic each year in European farmlands. It's all over Europe, soils are concerned by this pollution. And of course, we heard about these agricultural plastics. So 7.4 million of tons of plastics are used in the agricultural sector each year. In fertilizers, in non-woven textiles, greenhouses, nets, and also plastic mulching. So plastic mulching which are directly in contact with the soil. Conventional plastic mulching film in polyethylene are sometimes replaced by biodegradable plastics, which are supposed to degrade in the soil, or they are not removed from the soil. They are incorporated in the soil after the cultivation season, and they are plowed by plowing. But as conventional plastics, they release microplastics, nanoplastics, and chemicals in the soil. And they are supposed to be biodegradable. It's European standards that say that they should degrade 90% of the film should degrade after 2 years in the soil. But these tests are made in optimal conditions of water content, of temperature, in the laboratory, and in real soils, you will never find these optimal conditions. So these plastic films, even if they are called biodegradable, they won't completely degrade. And sometimes there are two applications of these biodegradable films on the soil. so there's a problem of accumulation. And so all these microplastics have impact on soil biodiversity, on earth norms, for example, that are very important for the aeration of the soil. They have impact on water transfer, and they can accumulate. They have been found down to 90 centimeter depth in the soil. So I don't see any cleanup strategy that could be found to remove this microplastic from the soil. They have also an impact on plants, genotoxicity, delayed germination, and they can decrease agricultural yields, this microplastic. They can impact also plant quality, because the plant can assimilate nanoplastic, and nanoplastic can also facilitate the uptake by plants of other toxic chemicals. And nanoplastic have been found in edible parts of fruits and vegetables. So all the functions, at the beginning I told you about this wonderful ecosystem that we have on Earth that can filtrate water, mitigate climate change through carbon storage, or support biodiversity and produce our food. And all these functions are threatened by the presence of microplastics in the soil. So we have to think very carefully on the long-term effect of the use of agricultural plastic. For example, we have to balance the short-term effects they have on the production and the long-term effects they will have for future generations, and think as all other plastics in all other economic sector, are they essential, are they safe, and are they sustainable? And also for the organic fertilizers, it's very important for many regions of the world to have this organic input. It's essential for sustaining soil fertility. But if we want to have a clean organic matter so if we have to have clean organic fertilizer, we have to reduce our consumption and our production of plastic. To conclude, it's just important to know the impact of all over the food production chain, and also the indirect impact on soil function that are impacting agriculture and food security. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Marie-France. I can see colleagues already started to talk to each other, and seems we have a lot of questions waiting for other speakers. Please feel free to do so when it's your turn. And I think Marie-France has left us with some very good questions, for example, for the agriculture plastics. All of them essential, safe, and sustainable. And also, I'm impressed by the data about the microplastic pollution in the sewage sludge. I know in some of the European countries, we are very proud of, like, we're doing our circular economy, we're making beneficial use of the sludge. But when we know the fact that those sludge that we are proud of are contaminated by microplastic and maybe other contaminants, then what shall we respond to that? So those are the questions. I don't have answers, and I look to speakers and audience here to have a good discussion. Let's move to the next speaker, Jane Manka, who is the Managing Director and Chief Scientific Officer of the Food Packaging Forum based in Switzerland. Thank you for coming over from Switzerland today. She leads scientific research and outreach projects and collaborates with external stakeholders from academia, industry, public interest groups, and media. She's a full scientific member of the Society of Toxicology, the American Chemical Society, the Society of Environmental Toxicology and Chemistry, and the Endocrine Society. She's also an active member of the Scientists Coalition for an Effective Plastic Treaty. So, Jane, we are moving from the soil pollution to the packaged food that we come into direct contact with on a daily basis. Like, this is my lunch day. I know you have a lot to say about this packaging. Now it's over to you, Jane, to tell us about the plastic chemicals and the hazards they pose to the society. Thank you.
So, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Now it's becoming a little bit more personal as we talk about our own diets. And this is an image that all of us know from any supermarket anywhere in the world, really, a lot of the foods that we consume are packaged. And food packaging, of course, matters in the food system. It protects foodstuff, it prevents food waste. It enables the logistics, the transport, and the sales of foodstuff. It supports effective communication and marketing. It's a very important role of food packaging, actually. And it's actually critical for modern food supply and consumption. But, of course, as we know from the ocean cleanup studies, we've all seen the pictures of plastic pollution. I thought I'd spare you one of those, but you know what it looks like. When we go to ocean cleanups, beaches, and so on across the world, the top 10 items that are found in these cleanups are food packaging, a lot of food packaging. Cigarette butts, I think they always fight for position 1 or 2, but there's at least 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 food packaging items that are regularly found. And these, of course, are oftentimes convenience, takeaway food packaging, but also other types of food packaging. So it's a major contributor to this plastic pollution, which we're currently trying to address. So in fact, most of the food that is consumed is packaged, or a lot of it, more than half, I should say. This is data from Portugal. I don't know what it's like in the UK. Maybe it would be a little bit more orange here, a bit less blue. And when we look at the types of packaging that are used to package our foodstuffs, so that's solid and liquid foods, you can see here that a lot of it is plastic, but there's also some hidden plastic, because plastic functionalizes packagation. And you can see that here in this packaging type that we call a beverage carton. Actually, the functionalization through plastic is essential. So the direct layer in contact with food on the inside of the beverage carton is plastic. And of course it makes sense, because we all know if you put cardboard into water, it dissolves, right? So it wouldn't hold any liquid. So there has to be a plastic layer. So it's a functionalization. This is maybe a bit more surprising. This is a fun YouTube video. If you want to watch it, I'm not going to show it because we don't have time. But this is an aluminum beverage can, standard. If you put it into very aggressive hydrochloric acid, you dissolve the aluminum, and the inside of the can, you can see here, is a kind of plastic-like transparent layer. This is an epoxy-based coating containing bisphenol A. So there's direct plastic in contact with your beverage, and it's the same for food cans also. Now, just a few key terms. I know that many of you are academics. If you're diving into the world of food contact materials, it can be a little bit complex to navigate. So we start with what we're familiar with, the final packaging. This we call a food contact article. Now, this looks so innocent, this little yogurt cup. It's actually a highly engineered item, because it can consist of a couple, 5, 6, 7, sometimes maybe more, different food contact materials. So food contact materials are your plastic, the lid, which may be aluminum, but the aluminum, as we just learned, is coated, so there's another coating, a varnish or something. Then you have printing inks, you have an adhesive to stick the lid onto the container, and so on and so forth. So food contact articles, highly engineered, consisting oftentimes of many different materials. What we're really interested in terms of these food contact articles and the work that I'm doing, are what we call the food contact chemicals. So what's the chemical composition, what are the chemicals constituents of these food contact materials and the food contact articles? And we coined this term, actually, food contact chemicals. So as Megan so beautifully explained in her introductory lecture, plastics consist not only of the monomers and polymers, but they also contain the non-intentionally added substances and the additives. And all of that falls under the term food contact chemical for us, if the plastic is in contact with food. And you can see here, there's also these impurities, reaction byproducts, degradation products, and so on. Why are we concerned about chemicals in food contact materials? Well, because of this phenomenon called migration, chemical migration. This has been extensively researched for more than 50 years, actually. We know that chemicals can transfer from food contact articles, such as packaging, but also processing equipment, or kitchenware, tableware, and so on, into food. No news there. Keep in mind, I'm not going to go into this, but just keep in mind that this phenomenon of migration is not a one-way street. It works the other way around as well. So your packaging material, if it's not inert, it can absorb chemicals as well. And that, of course, becomes very relevant when we talk about non-inert containers for reuse of food packaging or recycling. There's a couple of aspects which are relevant for driving migration. I think the most important and intuitive, of course, is temperature. If you increase the temperature, your migration rate will be higher. Storage time is relevant. The chemistry of the food stuff, is it acidic? Is there fat content? Actually, starting at 25% fat content already, you will get maximum migration of your lipid fat-soluble migrating chemicals. And then small portion sizes will have proportionally higher migration because the surface area in contact with the volume of food is larger in smaller size packaging. Good. So now we know about chemicals that migrate, that can transfer. Typically when I talk about this, people are interested, but it's like, yeah, okay, chemicals, it's very abstract. What people really are concerned about are microplastics. We just heard that. And we have a lot less information about microplastics originating from food contact articles, but there's a few first studies showing that food contact articles, the normal and intended use of food contact articles, can lead to the generation of micro and nanoplastics. So we have a study summarizing the available evidence coming out soon, hopefully. Okay, now I need to hurry up a bit. How many food contact chemicals are there? We compiled an inventory of about 14,000. Of these, we have evidence for migration for about 1,800. So this is not just plastic, this is all kinds of food contact materials, but plastics are the majority. And what experts say is that there could be up to 100,000 food contact chemicals that could potentially be migrated. That's because of these NIAS, these impurities, reaction byproducts, and so on. So a lot of chemicals there. Most of those are unknown. And again, unpublished data, for at least 3,601 of these food contact chemicals, we have evidence that they are present in humans, found in blood, urine, and so on. And of course, as Joe explained, there's concern about the role that these synthetic man-made chemicals play in the incidence of increasing non-communicable diseases worldwide. So it's an opportunity for prevention. That's a message of hope that I want to give you here. If we can get this right, we can prevent harm. And this is actually also the direction that is being taken right now, I want to say. So the European Food Safety Authority recently, a year ago, lowered the safe level for exposure to bisphenol A, one of these notorious chemicals, by a factor of 20,000. So that's good. The European Commission is now in the process of finalizing a new regulation on BPA, banning it for use in food contact. Of course, this means that each and every one of us currently has unsafe levels of BPA in their bodies, and that's, of course, not good. So it's really important to take action on that. Okay, so food packaging matters to health and the planet. I think it's important when we address plastic pollution that we do it in such a way that we don't create rebound effects. So recycling is potentially a challenge when it comes to the chemicals. We need to be aware of that. We have to understand packaging as an enabler of globalized food business models and retail. Very important. And shifting the food system towards health and sustainability means that we have to address packaging too, and we need to do it by implementing the waste hierarchy. Reduce, reuse, and then to a certain extent recycle, but ideally not back into food contact. So, and with that, I hope that we can shift from this to a bit more of this. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Jane. Obviously, you have won the mind and heart of a lot of our audience here. And I think I especially like the visual you showed about the transparent layer, plastic layer beneath the aluminum layer of the Coke can. And I think that's why Megan called the plastic issue being least transparent issue. Well, and on top of that, we have more than 100,000 different kinds of chemicals that could be possibly migrated from the packaging to the food that we don't have much knowledge about. I know there's transparency provision being negotiated under the plastic treaty, so that might be one of the things we need to take the opportunity and make sure we have a strong provision on that to make sure we make this non-transparent issue transparent, because we cannot regulate anything that's not transparent. And thank you for telling us the opportunity for prevention and opportunity to operationalize the waste hierarchy. We look forward to discuss with you further on that. And now, I would like to give the floor to our fourth speaker for this panel, who is Kostas Vallis. He's a lecturer in resource efficiency systems at the School of Civil Engineering from University of Leeds. And Kostas pioneers research focusing on enabling a sustainable circular economy and on preventing plastic pollution. His research has sought to quantify plastic pollution from local to global scale. Kostas, I would like to give the floor to you to share with us about what happens to plastics after they have been used, and where do they go, and with what effects, especially as challenges impacting low and middle income countries. Over to you. Thank you.
Right. It's such a pleasure to be here with you today. And so I don't have prepared a lengthy presentation as such, but what I'd like to take us is now just a step further from what we've seen. We've seen some of the challenges on the use phase of products that are associated either with the production of food, agricultural systems, or the packaging we're buying and using food. The challenges we're having also with plastics can be associated with what happens to them. And as you can see in these two pictures here, let me ask you, how many of you are familiar with situations like that? Have you seen those? Right, what have you seen those? Have you been in those places? You have seen, you've been. We're all very knowledgeable here, which is so heartening to start seeing that level of understanding, at least among the experts in the scientific communities. So we start understanding the problem of plastics as a problem mainly in the sea environments, but as you see now, we're looking at the entire life cycle of the economy, and we'll start looking also at different environmental media. And a fundamental challenge we're having that is that essentially, if you want to see the big picture, we're having a big source of plastics that are in a place where they shouldn't be, in our environment. Okay, and what are the biggest fates? They are released either as items, as single items, or they're burned. And we're not talking now about the energy from waste plants, sophisticated plants with super expansive, super effective air pollution control systems and containment systems. We're talking setting things on fire. Why does this happen? Because no one is going to pick the waste of these people. There's no provision of services and infrastructure. How many fellow humans, how many fellow citizens on this planet whose waste is not picked? This is a number we put there around 2 billion people. Depends how you see it. Our new modeling that is going to appear anytime soon, maybe have some slightly different numbers, but it doesn't really matter. Too many. Too many people consume plastic, use plastic, as Jen very clearly showed. A lot of it is in the form of packaging, actually. And then, because it's packaging, it very, very fastly becomes waste, solid waste. And a lot of the societies that they don't have the privilege that we're having here, for example, in London, to have our solid waste nicely collected, end up in situations like that. Now, this is also a disaster on its own, but it doesn't stop there. It continues, because the plastic is light, because the plastic is persistent, it degrades to a certain degree, it changes its properties under the environmental conditions, but fundamentally it persists enough to be transported throughout the world. So we're heading through different mechanisms. The big plastic items start breaking down through different mechanisms into smaller and smaller particles. Okay, being that abrasion, being that other mechanisms that change the, if you like, the compounds, and then Jamie talked about the migration. Also, there are different mechanisms that the chemicals or the products of the breaking down of the polymers that can be emitted also into the environment. So, this macroplastics challenge is the biggest source of microplastics. And if we don't stop that source, we already have microplastics dispersed everywhere on the planet, in our bodies, in all that. I'm not going to persist on that, but we already have a huge dispersion of microplastics, both from items that were constructed as such in the first place, or mainly now starts becoming plastics that have been in the environment and little by little are breaking into smaller pieces. So it's absolutely also critical for stopping and mitigating the microplastics future challenge, which is going to keep escalating, to stop the macroplastics challenge as well. Now, as I said, we start realizing that things were wrong in the water, on our beaches, now on land, on agricultural systems, and now what? What's that? We start seeing something that was really invisible. And what's that? That's the open burning. But I'll come to that in a second. So we have all these scientific debates, and I have to say, I have to be honest with you, my opinion on that is that our science is immature. We have very little scientific certainty. This shouldn't stop us from acting. This shouldn't stop us from decisively moving to obtain the information that we need and making judgments on what is important and what is not important. But to do that, we need to start building together, bringing together the evidence. And that's one of the things I've been trying to do over the last few years, creating different levels, methodologies, working with many other academics and institutions around the world to quantify plastics pollution, to quantify the mechanisms, to describe the mechanisms, the phenomena that taken the plastics are getting them, especially the macroplastics, the bigger items, where there shouldn't be in the very first place. So how much they're getting out on the soil, how much they're getting in our rivers, how much they're being openly burned. And these are some of the methodologies. I'm not going to dwell on that, but I'm going to close with showing you that. That's a systematic review we have conducted around the evidence for the damage from openly burning in an open, uncontrolled manner, setting the plastic waste on fire. As I said, our new research is about to appear on that, so I don't want to preempt it. But roughly speaking, we understand now that around half of all the plastics that are mismanaged around the world, they're set on fire like that. So we're talking about not just the non-intentionally added substances that have been mentioned there. It could be anything from the monomers that are left or to things, thank you. Or, and we're not talking just about the additives and other types of functionality chemicals that are in there. We're talking about a huge amount of unwanted chemistry that is generated when we're burning the plastics in this fashion. Most interestingly, the most exposed communities are those who are the most vulnerable also, because the people who live close to the waste and people live close to dump sites, in informal settlements, and so on. So this is only one aspect. There are other aspects that the plastics are damaging in the end of their life cycle. But we have to start understanding now and put that piece of information into the way we're balancing things and we're measuring things. All this packaging that you use in many parts of the world, I don't want to mention particular parts, you have some experiences of your own, but in many parts of the world, all this packaging that we use to buy and to be able to consume our food, to enjoy our food in this particular way, may end up really resulting in major dispersed pollution, both in microplastics that are going to break down in microplastics or directly the chemicals that are released through the open burning. Of course, there is a dimension of climate forcing also on that, which is not related to health. So this is not talking just about, of course, the food dimension there, but there is a very, very strong food relevance because a lot of that material is actually associated with the food production and consumption, and we have to consider it. So I have added to the excellent presentations of my colleagues, and I'll be very pleased to discuss with you later on. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kostas. We have slightly adjusted our arrangement. We have about 18 minutes for Q&A, and I would like to invite all our four speakers to sit here. Suzanne, Marie-France, Jane, and Carlos. And it's a time for our enthusiastic audiences and colleagues to raise your questions or reflections based on the presentation you have just heard.
Thank you for this eye-opening session. I'm trying to figure out what is then the next action. Living in Kenya, where they have banned the plastic bags, but interestingly, they identified another plastic options to carry and to buy fruits and vegetables, which is a plastic net. It's a little thicker, it doesn't fly around that easily, but it's the only solution they found, as paper is also a natural resource which is quite difficult to harvest, manufacture, etc. Cotton is another solution, cotton bags, but how do we get the cotton produced? So I'm wondering, what are our solutions in all this, apart from avoiding plastic, not using them? Maybe it would be a safer production, looking into that.
The final question of this round, and then we will pass to our panelists, please.
Okay. A different one. So what I'm talking about to get rid of it.
That's a very, very good question. I also want to have some answers from our panelists.
Okay, so thank you so much. Excellent questions. So you mentioned the replacement for the plastic carrier bags. And so we didn't really get into that in detail, but I briefly talked about the waste hierarchy, which is a strategy how to manage waste by reducing environmental impact. And the least environmental impact, is quite logical, we have if we don't have packaging at all. But of course, in order to implement that as a solution, as you say, we need to change the business models. We need to change how do we produce, process, consume foods, right? So that's a more systemic level, more systemic intervention. It's not a low-hanging fruit. It's not a silver bullet solution. It's strenuous. I think the next best option would be to have reusable packaging. And I don't quite understand why you don't like cotton bags. I live with a cotton bag in my handbag, so when I go to the bakery or go buy some fruit, I have my reusable cotton bag, which I wash at home. It doesn't produce microplastics when I wash it. So I think that's a behavioral change. And that, again, needs also the business community to embrace it, because it may make people a bit more conscious consumers. And they won't buy on the fly. You have to plan your shopping and so on. So I think there's a couple of responses that we can try to work towards. But it's work. It moves a little bit away from convenience and from overconsumption. You want to add something?
Sure, thank you. I think what you say makes a lot of sense. And I'd just like to add to the complexity and maybe blindness of intention of our policies here. I don't know if you realize, but these thin plastic bags that we had in the first place, all these plastic bottles that become thinner and thinner plastic, has historically been the hero material for eco-efficiency policies we've been trying to implement in the European Union for decades. We passed laws, we made incentives, we gave huge incentives to use a lighter material such as plastic to have less greenhouse gases from transportation of heavy materials in a globalized supply chain. So plastic became such a good material for the eco-efficiency agenda. We were blind to the other things that we're doing. So there is no easy solutions there. You talked about Kenya. You go in an informal settlement over there. You go to Kimbira, for example, anywhere. I mean, what's the problem there? What's the fundamental challenge? That the poor people go to any informal settlement, 90% of the materials, and I'm just coming up with this number, I haven't studied that, but 90% of their materials are just plastic and without any quality control or food contact levels that we have there. So it's also the material of choice for the poor people. The poor people wouldn't be able to live without these materials. So this is the sort of challenges we're having now. So making some of this material a bit lighter, prohibiting one product, replacing it a bit with another, yes, these are tiny changes. Maybe they're symbolic. Are they solving the problem? I highly doubt it. So that's why I totally subscribe with what Jane said. We have to look at things holistically. We have to see the way we're producing or consuming. We have to see what is the fate of the materials realistically. And these small changes are not going to solve the problem. I'm absolutely confident about it.
In regards to conflict of interest in the negotiations for the plastics treaty, my experience in INC 3 and 4 is that we as the Indigenous Peoples Caucus, we are fighting for those 2 minutes of space on the plenary floor to speak about the impacts in our communities. We're the ones most impacted, and we're seeing so many industry people that are in there trying to negotiate treaty,
but how are they coming in an objective viewpoint? And so we shouldn't be fighting for 2 minutes of space. As Indigenous people sovereign to the land bases that we come from, we should have a voice at the table. And the traditional ecological knowledge that we bring as experts within our communities, combined with the research of the scientists who are balancing Western and traditional knowledge systems, so that we can have a voice, that we can speak with knowledge and understanding and bring wisdom to all of the delegates as they're negotiating this treaty and really understanding the impacts. There has to be a willingness from industry to change the process and how they're manufacturing. And we also have to look at the death cycle of the plastics at the beginning of resource extraction, because that's where it's most definitely impacting our future generations. Absolutely.
There were two other questions, maybe just briefly. Yes, paper cups have a plastic liner on the inside. That's one aspect. What I also find interesting is oftentimes the cups are printed on the outside, and if you think about when you go to the coffee shop, the cups are stacked inside each other. And so there's this phenomenon of offset migration. So you will get printing inks that transfer from the outside of one cup to the inside of another cup, which is a form of migration. Yes. And then to the lady at the back, it resonates with me what you said. How do we get rid of these plastic particles and chemicals and so on? So in terms of the science, human exposure to micro nanoplastics, the methods are only just emerging right now, so we don't have a clear picture of actual exposure. I know there are a few studies out there showing or hypothesizing human exposure to micro nanoplastics. And I'm speaking in an academic setting, so please understand this correctly. I'm not downplaying the risk. I'm just saying that the methods and the approaches to measuring micro nanoplastics in human tissue are not robustly developed yet, and we probably have quite a few ways of getting systematic errors in there. So artifacts from sampling, maybe also from the analysis process. So this is an emerging field, okay? So we don't have full clarity yet on how much exposure we have to micro nanoplastics internally. Chemicals, we have a lot of knowledge. We have decades of research, and we have decades of research, longitudinal studies, very good, robust epidemiological studies, how plastic chemicals impact human health. Fortunately, there are also dietary intervention studies showing that if you reduce your exposure, you choose unprocessed foods, unpackaged foods, minimize your exposure through other routes, personal care, textiles, and so on, your body burdens can come down. So that's the good news. The only really, really tricky group of chemicals are the PFAS, para- and polyfluoroalkyl substances, which are the forever chemicals, which have half-lives of up to 3.5 years in the human body. So it's really important that we stop any intentional use of these PFAS, especially in food packaging, food content materials. It's great that the European Union is leading the way with this, but we have to get it out of our drinking water. We have to get it out of the soils. PFAS are really bad news, really, really bad news. So, thanks.
Thank you very much. I think those are very good questions. I just would like to compliment to what colleagues have been saying. For the conflict of interest, there was an analysis of how many private sector with conflict of interest were there at INC4 negotiation, and their number is approaching 200. I think it's more than the whole EU delegation. It's more than the whole small island countries delegation. That's a number. And what they do there, well, on top of this lobby work they normally do, there have been reporting from our scientists that they get harassed by some of the private sector there just for telling the truth of the science. So that has implication on what the conflict of interest policy should be set in this treaty. I don't think we have the chance to talk in details in our negotiation yet, but I definitely believe this is an important area to talk about. The other one is about what's in our body and how can we get rid of it or tackle that. Obviously, we are all caring about our own health, but when I pose this same question to some of the key negotiators of key countries, a lot of them, we call them blocking countries, they don't want the strong treaty. You just say that, oh, we know that, I have no doubt we have microplastic and chemicals in my body, but I don't care. So I feel like there is another area of work we might need to work with some of the negotiators, help them to understand better what's the risk posing to them. I'm now going to pass to Joe. He's going to make a very quick announcement before we move to the next session. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. That concludes our first session. Thank you very much for sticking with us.
Colleagues, it's our last part of this special plastic session today. We have heard very good sharing of experience and evidence by our four fantastic speakers in the last panel. And now the natural question would be, so what? What should be our response in different contexts, especially but not only limited to the plastic treaty under negotiation? So we are going to have four panelists here. I would like to invite all of them come to join me up front here. Our first panelist is Carlos Monteiro from University of Sao Paulo, and he is a professor of nutrition and public health at the University of Sao Paulo, Brazil, and head of the university's Center for Epidemiological Studies in Health and Nutrition. His research includes methods to assess populations' nutritional and food intake, secular trends, and biological and socioeconomic determinants of nutritional deficiencies and obesity and other nutrition-related chronic diseases, food processing in the food system and human health, and evaluation of food and nutrition programs and policies. So Carlos, if you are ready, you are a nutritionalist who has pioneered the way we characterize unhealthy ultra-processed foods. Could you please share with us about the impacts of those ultra-processed foods, and based on the sharings you heard earlier today, reflect on how they might interact with plastics, please? The floor is yours. You have about 5 minutes maximum. Thank you.
Thank you. So I want to start by saying that this concept of ultra-processed food was created as a way to understand the relationship between diet and health in a modern world, right? With all the changes we see in the food system, and specifically to understand the link between the changes in diet and the pandemic of obesity, diabetes that we see in the last 20, 30 years in almost all countries. The old paradigm of nutrition science related, in general, one nutrient to one disease. So the lack of one nutrient, iron, causes anemia, or the increase in some nutrients cause other diseases. This paradigm worked very well to explain nutritional deficiencies, scurvy, beriberi, iron deficiency anemia, and actually nutrition science was born discovering nutrients and associated with diseases. So this pattern didn't explain absolutely the pandemic of obesity and diabetes. Initially, some people proposed that the people were consuming a lot of fat, much more fat, and that's why they were fat, right? So then we had this sugar explanation. Together with this, we had the industry producing low-fat, low-sugar products, and this didn't work. The countries where you have more alternative of diet products is where you have more obesity, more diabetes, right? So then we start to think in another explanation, more linked to changes in the food system, and then we came to food processing. And we realized that the role of food processing that has been very positive for centuries, for millennia. So human society has processed food for a long time. But with what purpose? To prolong duration of foods, to facilitate food preparation, and to enhance food sensory properties. In other ways, to promote consumption of foods. And in the last 20, 30 years, we start to see the food industry doing something different. Because the food industry discovered that it could be much higher profits if they start to produce products to replace foods and not to modify foods. And these are ultra-processed foods. Ultra-processed foods are essentially not foods. They are formulations of food substances that are extracted from a few high-yield crops like soy and corn, and are engineered as a way to replace real foods and to be overconsumed and to generate much more profit. So then the whole food system changes, and we start to have a few transnational corporations dominating the food industry, the food industry system. So a lot of epidemiological studies demonstrate that consumption of these ultra-processed foods are linked to many diseases, from obesity to dementia, as I showed in my presentation yesterday. And then a lot of researchers start to clarify why these ultra-processed foods increase disease. And this is where plastic comes into the discussion. There are several mechanisms that well demonstrated. One is overeating, for instance. These products people consume more. Additives are that we thought they were innocuous. Really, they are associated with disease, artificial sweeteners, emulsifiers, etc. And plastics released from packaged materials like bisphenol and phthalates. There are also evidence today that the more a person consumes ultra-processed foods, in the urine you have a higher concentration. But this is it's very incipient. We are just starting. But one important point is that probably the link between ultra-processed food and disease is due not just to only one mechanism. I mean, we have several, and this one is important. And also this can explain why, different from sugar or fat, we are not dealing with one disease. We are dealing with many diseases, and that represents the main global burden of disease today. So I think this, just to link the two things, I think this is very important, and if we reduce consumption of ultra-processed foods, we are helping in a way to resolve also the problem that we heard before about plastics in general. That's what I could do in 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Carlos. I think it's very consistent with what Jane has said, not only in terms of the chemicals could be migrated from the packaging to the food itself, but also in terms of we need to operationalize the waste hierarchy. We need to prevent and reduce first, both in terms of plastic production consumption as well as the overprocessed food consumption. Thank you very much. Now let's move to our second panelist, who is Ayaan Harari from Oxfam International. She is the regional climate justice lead for Oxfam International in Africa, leading climate advocacy and adaptation efforts across the African continent. She holds a master's degree in global health and nutrition and a degree in biological science from this Westminster University. So welcome home. Ayaan's experience includes positions with concern worldwide, the Danish Refugee Council and the Somali government, where she has focused on climate justice, health and social protection. Her work plays a crucial role in formulating policies and strategies to strengthen resilience against climate change in developing regions. So we are going to have a colleague sharing with us from the climate angle. So Ayaan, your work at Oxfam is concerned with both impacts and injustice of climate change, particularly across Africa. You have recently worked with pastoral communities in Somaliland who are living with serious risk of climate-driven food insecurity. Could you please tell us a bit more about the role that plastic greenhouses have played in supporting these populations and what this might mean in the discussion around the essential use versus non-essential use of plastics, as well as the just transition. The floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and thank you so much for having me here. It's a great pleasure to kind of share with you some experiences from the global south and from Somalia and from Africa. So before I answer the question of the greenhouse farming in Somaliland, I would like to share with you some figures. I like the figures of inequality and injustice around the world. So I work in the climate justice sector, and more kind of my work is advocacy and influencing global inequality and injustices related to climate. So the richest 1% of the whole world, the 1%, are actually emitting those greenhouse gas emissions that are killing people and destroying our planet. So let's say in Africa that they contribute to the emissions just 4%, but the richest 1% in the world are emitting 50% of the emissions. These emissions and greenhouse gas emissions is what's killing lives, destroying kind of humanity and our planet. My grandma says, like 30 years ago, 20 years ago, disasters would kind of were like every 10 years or every. But now, the country that I came from, Somalia, since 1990, we have experienced 12 droughts and 13 floods, which tells you there's either a disaster or flood in every year. You can imagine a country that was already fragile with developmental issues, and then climate comes and exacerbates the food insecurity, nutrition, gender disparities, health consequences. And again, we can say the developed and rich nations have gained a lot of profits from the industrial world, and the fossil fuel corporations are the ones actually kind of making, they say since 1980, 30 trillion, money was made, but the damages caused like, again, 20 trillion. So there's huge losses and damages in the global south. What we did as Oxfam to help these communities adapt to the climate change, there's huge issues related to climate finance. You see in the major conference, the COPs countries saying, we have pledged this amount of money, but it never reached to the community. So the small amount of funding that we have received from one of the donors, we did something called greenhouse gas farming, which again uses, like we call it essential plastics. The reason why we did that, these are pastoralists. All their life, 100 years, they have relied on the livestock, milk, livestock, to sell or to use, or to consume. And livestock pastoralism is kind of an identity. This is not an arable land. It's just, a place, kind of desert that, wait for rain. The only water they receive is for rain. So the rains were not coming. 5 failed rainy seasons. So they have lost everything. So you see mothers sitting there with their children, nothing in the table, nothing to feed. So we asked them, how can we help you? And then they said, we need diversification of livelihoods, such as like farming. So we kind of invest in a borehole and then come up with this idea of greenhouse gas farming, and then let's say greenhouse farming, and then they were able to grow vegetables like tomatoes, okras, some stuff. Like we have given like every 10 women one greenhouse farming, so they were able to feed their children, but again to make income out of it. So that's the best way to kind of prevent displacement and migration, to empower women, to kind of ensure food security at household level. It was very helpful, and some of the materials we were using were not proper plastic, the ones that we use here in the modern world, but more of a kind of, sorry, just 1 minute, more of a like renewable source. But I see that's a very essential. But if we get the maybe finance, or again ask, developed well to, of course, these emissions to invest in renewables, then we could at the same time use renewables and help families in another way to adapt to the climate reality and to save lives and the planet as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ayan, for reminding us of the interlinkages between the climate change crisis and plastic pollution, and also the synergies that a good solution could achieve without the need to compromising on another environmental or social challenges. And I think we need more discussion on this area. So I'd like to pass the floor to our third speaker, who is Karina Hawkes from FAO. She is a specialist in food systems. She is now the Director of Division of Food Systems and Food Safety for the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, FAO. Between 2016 and 2023, she was Director of Center for Food Policy at City of University of London. So, Karina, we know FAO started work on the topic of agricultural plastics 2 years ago, and is currently developing a voluntary code of conduct on this topic. Could you please share with us some more information about this work, and from the perspective of your expertise on systems, share some impressions for how the issues of plastics could benefit from more joined-up thinking among different disciplines and sectors, please. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's good to be here. Thanks very much for the invitation. So I'm here doing something I don't often do, which is to speak on the behalf of someone else, which is our Environment Division, our Climate Change, Environment and Biodiversity Division at FAO. They have a bioeconomy unit, and they lead our work on plastics. So what I was asked to do is just present from them about the FAO response to plastics. I'm just going to, we'll be reporting some information and then share some of my own reflections. So the policy response, the response from the FAO level has been threefold. It's around data and evidence, it's around fishing, and it's now more focused on the soils, but focusing on this voluntary code of conduct on use of plastics in agriculture, following the greater evidence that there's impact on soils, not just in the fisheries sector. So first of all, the policy response was in fisheries, and this may have been mentioned earlier, but some of you may be familiar with the terminology abandoned, lost, or otherwise discarded fishing gear. If that was mentioned earlier. And so in response to the use of plastics in fishing gear, FAO developed in 2019 the voluntary guidelines for the marking of fishing gear to try and address this issue, voluntary guidelines, and there's been a whole load of things since about the implementation of those guidelines. But that was in response to the evidence that abandoned, lost and discarded gear was causing havoc in the oceans. I'm not going to talk about the science here because I think that's been covered already, but there was concern among the FAO members. The second way that FAO has responded is on data. So it produced the first global assessment of plastics used in agriculture in 2019. And as a result of that, became particularly focused on the use of films in agriculture, given that they are 60% of the more 10 million tonnes used. I think that was covered earlier. So the amount used in agriculture is less than the amount used for packaging, but it's still a very substantial amount with more than 10 million tonnes. But now it's doing more analysis and more evidence. My own group in the food safety team in my own division is looking at the effect of food safety issues around microplastics, particularly around microbiome and some other issues. It's produced reports over the last couple of years. But the next phase of work, referring back to the point that was made earlier about there's an evolving science about how you measure these issues, is a partnership through our centre with the International Atomic Energy Agency, which is looking at using isotopic techniques to look at how plastics interacting with soils, how they're broken down, what the impact is on soil health. So that's a big area of work. And then the third area is on this, in support of the UN Plastics Treaty, a voluntary code on a voluntary code of conduct on the sustainable use of plastics in agriculture. That was specifically requested by the FAO Committee of Agriculture. So the way that FAO is governed, we're an institution with members, the countries, and we have several committees, and the Committee on Agriculture is an important one of those committees. And when they request something from FAO, in this case a voluntary code, it means they're really worried about it and they're really taking it seriously. So it's a voluntary code in support of the internationally legally binding instrument that will be in the UN Plastics Treaty. And it aims to take a science-based approach, providing guiding principles and standards for responsible practices. And just to end in the last, so that's going on ahead. That will be released in October of this year. I think it's October. I have the paper in front of me. Yes, it will be produced at the 29th session of the Committee on Agriculture at end of September, beginning of October. So that will be scheduled for release at that point. And just to end with some messaging around the food systems approach and how to take a systemic view of these issues, there are three areas that are really come out here. The first is, and I'm sure you've discussed this today, is the need to take a holistic approach to the whole life cycle. So even in agriculture, it doesn't just end in agriculture. Something happens to those plastics. You know, they wash out into poor communities and so on. I mean, you need to take a life cycle approach. The second issue is the engagement of people across the system and how you do that. Of course, there are conflicts of interest, left, right, and centre. But there's also farmers and fisher people with lived experience and dealing with the challenging issues around livelihoods and making sure that there's inclusive voices across the system. And the third and most complex one is around the benefits and trade-offs. So from an FAO perspective, as an organisation, we will always say, well, there are some benefits of plastics and there are some problems with plastics from across the food system. And we need to weigh up all of those benefits and trade-offs. And that's obviously very challenging and should be a good area for research, an important area of research to understand that, and looking at the environmental, social and economic dimensions of sustainability. And it struck me, there was a very good point made earlier about use of cotton bags. But if you're looking at it from an agri-food system perspective, of course, cotton is a disaster for the environment and terrible use of water and all kinds of problems with use of cotton as an agricultural product. So that's not to say we shouldn't be using, I'm not making any judgment here, I'm not an expert, a technical expert on the subject, but it does suggest that these trade-offs and really taking the trade-offs and really seriously and really looking into them and then hopefully creating synergies of the one that we've just heard about. But that's critical and important in this area. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Karina. I think you have already provided us with a few very important keywords, including the holistic approach, including the whole life cycle, and including the benefits and trade-offs. I think that also echoes what Ayan has been sharing, like whenever we are thinking about promoting or founding a solution, we need to think about maximize the synergies and minimize and reduce the trade-offs as much as possible when we are comparing among different solution options. And you have also touched on the fishing gear, and coincidentally, this is one of the areas that the organization of our next speaker keyword. Maybe he himself is not specifically working on that, but his organization definitely has a lot to say on that. So our next speaker in this panel is Jacob King-Hammerson from the Environmental Investigation Agency, EIA, based in London. He is a campaigner of the Ocean Programme and focusing on the negotiation towards an effective new global plastics treaty. And while working on the treaty at large, he has a particular focus and interest on plastic production, on the means of implementation, and on equitable engagement of stakeholders. I think also this is something Karina emphasized about stakeholder engagement. So Jacob, your work at EIA has brought you here. into this plastic treaty negotiation discussion. And reflecting on what you have heard today, could you please share with us about the implication of food system plastic pollution on the treaty negotiation itself, as well as the other way around, the implication of the negotiation for the food system plastics? Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you for the question, Melissa. I'll try my very best in 5 minutes to answer that question. We heard from Megan just at the beginning a kind of picture of the state we're in with the Plastics Treaty, with a lot to do, but there is a lot at stake and a huge opportunity for the Plastics Treaty to take a systemic life cycle or death cycle, if we've had, an approach that across from the very point of extraction to the end of life, and when it enters into our environment, how we can actually start to address that as a global community. So it's obviously a very clear case for food systems and plastics in general that we need good legally binding international governance. Food systems are global in nature. Plastics are a transboundary issue in nature. This is something that needs to be addressed at a global scale, looking holistically. So what can the Global Plastics Treaty do on plastics? Well, it can, and in the text that we have, it can do very many things. It could curb and cap the amount of plastics we produce globally and start to bring it down. Which, at least from environmental investigation agencies' point of view, is the most important thing that it could do. It could introduce product design rules, promote reuse. It could improve end-of-life management and waste management, and promote good environmentally sound recycling, if such a thing exists. It really has, we have a huge opportunity to make sure that this is a strong legally binding instrument, because regulation for plastics, different types of plastics, good governance is lacking, which is causing issues. It causes issues with inconsistencies, where you see countries like the EU banning certain chemicals or pesticides in the EU, but still producing them and exporting them to the global south. You also have a lack of comprehensive legally binding solutions, and the voluntary guidelines on gear marking and voluntary code of conduct for agricultural plastics are amazing initiatives. And what the Global Plastics Treaty could do is take that forward and create legally binding obligations that are required. So a huge opportunity, but also a treaty-making process that is highly complex. And so how do we take the tools that we have, that the Global Plastics Treaty can create, and if I can extend the metaphor, how do we build the house that we want to see, all these measures across these different sectors that we have? And the Plastics Treaty has something which is quite a novel approach in international lawmaking in the zero draft text, which is something called dedicated programs of work. And these are a way to take these measures that we have in our hand and take them into a sectoral approach and make good governance. So they're a mechanism that could undertake to facilitate bespoke and effective regulations and cooperations for the unique characteristics, materials, products, treatment and challenges of different sectors. And obviously agriculture, fisheries are really good examples of those sectors. And it's also an opportunity to enhance expertise and then also allocate the resources effectively as we start to implement the treaty at a global level. And I think one of the things that critically we want to ensure that these are able to do is that stakeholders from across the value chain are involved in the development of this governance. So this would include, if you're thinking about agriculture, for example, this would include farmers, laborers, agricultural business retailers, producers, recyclers, consumers, research institutions, and indigenous peoples holders of that traditional ecological knowledge that we've heard is so important. That we can bring those people together to inform the international regulation and process, and also try and make sure we don't rest on our laurels, that hopefully at the end of 2025 we sign this treaty and then we don't just sit back and say, oh great, that's done. We actually take what we've done and effectively implement that, because plastics is clearly such a crisis for biodiversity, climate, pollution, food systems. So I think we have a great opportunity, and it's also really important that all these people are involved in these decision makings, because, as you say, the trade-offs and potential alternatives, and looking at things. How are we looking at these alternatives, and what are the trade-offs, and how do we promote things like agroecology, permaculture, indigenous cultivation practices, where they've been cultivating food for many thousands of years without having to use plastics. So we have a great opportunity, and we also, I think I'm standing in between the opportunity to hear from the man himself who's going to hopefully steer the ship into harbour. If afterwards, if anyone's interested in discussing how to feed in this information with myself, or this type of approach, then I'd be very happy to speak with you afterwards.
Thank you, Jacob. I would like to invite our panelists to stay here for a while when I give the floor to our special guest today, Ambassador Luis Valdivieso, who is the chair of the INC for the Plastic Treaty. Luis, we have touched on a lot of relevant topics of the INC negotiation, like chemicals of concern, the plastic production reduction, the difficult one, the indigenous rights and knowledge, and the transparency, and a lot of those things. We would like to hear from you of your reflections and give us some closing reflections, as well as how we, this community here, can help you to do your chair work. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Melissa, and thank you to everybody. It's so nice to be here. My honor to be here, actually, in front of you. A lot of familiar faces, but also new faces, and I'm happy to be here with all of you to tell you, to answer your question directly. We won't be able to do anything in this treaty without the contribution of the scientific community, of academia, and yes, other stakeholders, but specifically talking about the scientific community and academia. It will be not difficult. It will be impossible to go ahead with this negotiation, and later on, like Jacob had mentioned, to implement. Because we do need an effective treaty, but we need also a robust and ambitious implementation. Indigenous community, quite important in this negotiation, and later also in the implementation. And yes, we do face situations like you have mentioned, and thank you for saying that. And at the same time, we see how it has increased the participation of observers, stakeholders. If we see INC 1, we were around 2,000 participants, and around 1,000 were from observers, civil society, academia, scientific community, indigenous groups, private sector. And it has grown from 1,000 to 2,000, and now we were over 3,000 in INC4 from observers, stakeholders. So that was great. It was great. And I'm trying to, and really working hard to listen to everybody, and not only to listen, but to get the contribution for this treaty. Hearing what I have heard today, and also during the process, I get a question to you too. How do we get to this point? How do we get to the point that we are using products, and I have been using them too, I have to confess, products that will last seconds in our hands, plastic bags, straws, and others, and they will last hundreds of years, 300, 400 years, 500 years in nature. It's crazy. It's crazy. And it's not only that the problem. It's not that we are using for a few seconds that product and leave it into the nature and it stays there for 400 years. Those 400 years are going to be 400 years of pollution from that product. And it's going to damage nature, and it has already damaged a lot of our environment and is in our bodies. We have heard, we do have scientific evidence, we do have a great contribution, actually quite bad news from the scientific community, bad news how bad this is in our bodies. When we adopt 2 years ago the resolution 514 from UNEA, March 2022, if you see the resolution, you will see in the preamble of the resolution the mention to human health. And yes, it is mentioned. Also, you will see a couple of times mentioned the contribution or the need to work with the scientific community. But since then, 2 years from the moment that we adopt the resolution until the moment that we are now in INC 4 in April, a lot of scientific community has contributed so much that has made realize the negotiators how bad it is and where we have to point also our negotiations, our treaty. It is to that, to the, of course, environment, but also human health. That's so important. We are talking about chemicals in the products, and that's what is polluting a lot our environment and our bodies. We are talking about 16 chemical chains in the products, and we have evidence of maybe 3,000 or less, and still, out of those 3,000, we need to hear a lot more. So we don't know what is there. We don't know what is happening with polymers and what will happen later on. So that's why it is very important now, the contribution of the scientific community in the negotiations and later on for the implementation. And Jacob mentioned too, it will take some time until we get this convention entering into force. It is a negotiation of member states, of countries, yes, but it was you, it was civil society who mentioned a lot before, decades before we start negotiating, the danger of plastic pollution, the danger of plastic pollution in our bodies, in our environment. So please, we need you. We member states are quite slow the moment that we need to negotiate. We are quite slow. That was we have to revise. It was great that in INC 4 we start negotiating, real negotiation, because INC 1, 2, and 3, actually, we were not negotiating. Sometimes they say, when we go to get a cup of coffee among delegates, we do negotiate too. No. Really, negotiations start now, unfortunately, not before, but they start now in INC 4. Negotiating in a room with text on the screens, bracketing the text, real negotiations. But still, we only have one more INC. We have only one more round of negotiation. 60 more hours of negotiation. That is not much. It's not much. So we need to be quite efficient. We need to be quite effective to get to an efficient and effective treaty that will also be effective in its implementation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Luis. Personally, I feel really encouraged by the commitment from our chair of this very important process. We have only one session left in front of us. We have so many brackets we need to address. We don't know how yet, but I hope I could, on behalf of this committee, to commit that we will do our very best to support you as a chair, and we will work together towards an effective plastic treaty. It's not only for any of us individually, it's for the whole world, and we would like to take all different people from different background, different community, all on board the same ship. We are going to have a treaty not only addressing plastic pollution, but also achieving synergies with climate challenges, synergies addressing the biodiversity loss, and also we are helping colleagues also achieving the social justice in this just transition journey. So thank you very much, Luis. We feel so honored to have you here. I know colleagues might have more questions. Yeah, I'm looking at Joe if we still have time for Q&A. If not, okay, we have 5 minutes for Q&A. If you have burning questions, and our speakers, most of them are going to stay afterwards for 1 hour, so please, we're going to take 2 questions maximum.
Okay. My name's Patty Randall, and I'm from IPFAN, which has been working with Codex and WHO for many, many years, 40 years, over 40 years. And basically, what I think is missing is actually getting controls on marketing. We have to get controls on marketing of these ultra-processed foods. And those controls will be mostly affected by Codex. And Codex, the trading standards body, will actually be affected by the fact that it needs transformation. It's so weak. It needs to be strengthened and transformed into something that really does protect health, environment, animal welfare. It's absolutely critical. I mean, I'm protecting breastfeeding and babies, but that's just one small part of it. It's all these products. You could stop the marketing, and then you might get some slowing down of some of this ridiculous marketing and swimming with rubbish, really.
Thank you. I was wondering regarding food safety, because one of the arguments I see often that food is wrapped because of food safety and microbial contamination. Food safety has increased because of plastic, that's for sure. So we have less cases of diarrhea and a reduced mortality. So we need to find a way out of this vicious cycle in terms of handling food. And I'm not talking here about ultra-processed food, I'm talking here about handling, because it also reduces food waste and loss. And I would like to also better understand the role of the food industry and where they identify solutions, the packaging industry, what kind of solutions we may have there, to reduce the portion sizes to a way that we have the single household served in an appropriate manner, but still have a way of wrapping which allows us to conserve the food as long as possible as needed. Because if I'm going to an unpackaged food store, I see that in the back of the store, the food is packed in plastic. So I may be coming with my jar to fill a portion, but in the back side, you see all the wrapping and the packaging material. Thank you.
Give the floor to Marie-France as our panelist, because she didn't get a chance to speak at the end of panel. That's my fault. So can you...
No, but I have also a question, so I can speak now. I have a question on the full life cycle of plastic, especially in the agricultural sector, because I see a huge paradox in this, because one of the biggest threats for agriculture today is climate change everywhere, not particularly in the global south, but also in Europe, water scarcity and drought and extreme weather events. And one of the responses to this is, for example, to use plastic mulching, because it will decrease water evaporation. But we know that plastics are at the center of the climate crisis and are exacerbating this crisis. So we are using a solution. Personally, if I'm trying to find a solution to a problem and I realize that the solution I've chosen is exacerbating the problem I was trying to solve, I will say that I'm wrong, it's the wrong solution. I think maybe we have to think a more systemic change in the agricultural sector also, taking into account all the problems. And it's not just plastic in agriculture, it's also all the chemicals which are used, fertilizers, pesticides, all are made out of fossil resources and petrochemicals. So how we can address this complex paradox.
Thank you. So now over to our panelists. I think Jacob would like to take the floor first.
Just to very quickly respond to the role of companies from your question. One of the things that EIA have been doing for a number of years is working with the UK grocery retail sector on their plastics use. And so we kind of had to keep in mind some of the drivers of plastic use in agriculture, not just the packaging, for example. And so some of the things some of the roundtables that we've had with growers and also with the retail sector is that there are still things driving plastics use, like non-essential, non-nutritional aesthetic sourcing requirements on produce that are driving plastics use. So the aesthetic requirements on a pepper to be this red or this shaped is driving greater plastics use and water use. So the companies do have a role to then change their sourcing and not put on those requirements that are driving more plastic use. So there is this big look that the companies do have a huge role to play in it.
Just perhaps to, Patty mentioned the need to restrict marketing of unhealthy commodities in general, right? So I think, and I was linking this with a speech from the UN Secretary saying about the prohibition of fossil fuels marketing. So I think perhaps we should think in a more UN framework convention or something to regulate this, or at least to denounce, or to make these people less comfortable. And we saw these plastics also, they are using the same strategies to make this very, very efficient, very sophisticated. So I think that's is a good solution.
Just to quickly add to that, the example of like tobacco, for example, that has different restrictions on marketing and things, but also in terms of the Framework Convention on Tobacco Controls, did something where, in terms of addressing conflict of interest, the tobacco industry, there was a firewall put up between the tobacco industry and the negotiators for the treaty, because it was understood that there's a fundamental conflict of interest between protecting human health from smoking and the business of selling cigarettes. And we have to then ask ourselves the question, is there a fundamental conflict of interest between protecting human health, the environment and people from plastics and food systems from the impacts of plastics, and those that make their money from producing and selling them? I would say there is a conflict of interest there, but that's something that we really need to consider in the design of this treaty in the future. I think it's really important when we're talking about how do we get independent information across the value chain into the hands of delegates who maybe aren't experts in food systems who are making these decisions. We need to be sure that they're getting independent information that is free from these conflicts of interest. So that is another thing that we could potentially do.
Yeah, I just wanted to respond to the question of moving to more green solutions, and your question about we should not be adding to the problem that exists already, but sometimes you have to choose between saving lives, which is an immediate. And let me say this, the country like Somalia has zero contribution to the emissions, and the people of the pastoralist rural communities we're talking about they are completely, I would say, safe and green, because they don't have technology, there's no lights, they live in the most natural environment they could, but things that's happening in our modern world, it's what's affecting them, and their capacity is very limited, the capacity to adapt. They don't even know what climate change is and why is this happening to their lives. So we thought of what can we do for them. And again, just transition needs quite huge investment, and we push the corporations who are making huge profits in the, in the suffering of the people, to at least put some funding into moving to a green solution so we save the world. Yes, but I really agree with you, we need to kind of find green solutions to affect the impact of climate there.
I know we're getting towards the end here, but just to respond to a couple of points around food safety and some of the other issues that have come up of these trade-offs. I mean, this is the point that the whole design of the food system in an industrialized model, it needs plastics, it needs marketing. I mean, that's the industrialized food system. That's what the problem is that we're facing. And tomorrow morning, I'll be in the food system session. I'll be talking about why this means, the need for transformation of food systems fundamentally. Of course, that means very different things to different people, which is always an issue for conflict. But in the meantime, I think there's more work that's being done to try and understand the implications. So in our food safety group, there's a foresight team that are looking at and producing reports about the circular economy, about when you use plastics in packaging and then what the circular economy implications are. And you find that when you stop using plastics for food safety reasons, when you stop using plastics for food wrapping, then it has other implications in the system. So there's always these things, and the point about using plastics in order to address one problem and mask the problem elsewhere is because the systemic failure. It's the failure of the system. The system isn't functioning to deliver sustainability, to deliver health, and so on. So that's why we need to think about these big issues around transformation of systems. Just very briefly about Codex. I have been since September the interim secretary of Codex, as Patty knows, and I will be for another week or so, I believe, since they've just appointed a proper secretary. I was just standing in for a gap. But it's another interesting example. I'm not going to get into critiques of Codex, but the Codex Committee on the Methods of Analysis and Sampling is looking into this issue of the analytical techniques that have come up. So it's playing that kind of a role. But an interesting case of this is how there's a new agenda item on the agenda of Codex, which is looking at the implications of the use of recycled packaging on food safety. So that's an example of why there's more recycled food packaging, including recycled plastics, and that has now created another issue which Codex is now looking at, which is the impact of recycling on food safety. So it kind of never ends, which is why we have systemic failure that we need to deal with. Thank you.
I just wanted to make one final point and related to the climate change issue, and obviously that was mentioned, and the potential importance of this treaty is that we're using more and more plastics in food systems to correct for the effects of climate change and the impacts that we've had on the environment. But as Megan mentioned at the very top, that 99% of plastics are made from fossil fuels. If we're able to leave Busan with a treaty that is going to reduce the overall volumes of plastic that we produce, the Global Plastics Treaty will be the biggest climate deal that we would ever have made as a global community. It would be the biggest source of absolute emissions avoided, greenhouse gas emissions avoided by taking this step. The way to facilitate a managed and phased down and a just transition for people is an important question. But if we are to achieve that, this is potentially the biggest climate deal that we can achieve, and it's right, it's in our hands. We still have the opportunity, but we need to really fight for it. So we still need people calling for the importance of it, understanding it, and sharing that information with as many people as you can. So that is something important there. Legally binding, exactly. That's a very crucial part of it. Legally binding.
Thank you. And Luis, I think we have a lot of more challenges, but also opportunities for you to take on to work with the whole INC community. And thank you very much to our panelists and to our audience for staying here. I hope you all find this session useful.
Yes, just really to wrap up and say thank you so much, everyone, for coming, for staying. It's a long session. It's a lot to cover. We didn't even, we just scraped the surface. You can see, we need more people working on this. If you think you can help what you're doing, get involved, get in touch. There's collaboration going forward. Thank you to all our speakers for coming, giving up your time, your expertise, your experiences, your traumas. It really means a lot to us that you've come to do this. Thank you to Melissa for taking us through the whole session so expertly. That's Grace. And to Megan for curating it with me as well the whole way through, and for those slides, which are amazing. Ambassador Valles, thank you so much. Your commitment, your leadership through this process, demonstrating that you're placing science and wisdom and indigenous peoples at the centre of this treaty, really, really means a lot. And that you came here today and you've been so involved with this, we're very grateful. Thank you. Thank you very much. And yes, of course. So I was going to get to the audience. I've just been told there's 50, 60 people online as well. So if you joined online, thank you so much for joining, coming here. And To the Congress, again, thank you for allowing us to do this and for thinking expansively. This is a nutrition Congress, and here we are taking up 3 hours to talk about plastic. So I think we've come a long way as a community, and we can keep going. And finally, to the staff here and to everyone else, thank you so much.